A 17-year-old actress was supposed to be the final nail in the coffin of Hollywood's golden marriage. The studio executives eagerly anticipated her public breakdown, assuming the humiliated wife would surrender her crown without a fight. They fundamentally miscalculated her ruthlessness. She answered the public humiliation not with tears, but with a forensic legal audit that gutted his empire. Christine Kaufman's arrival didn't destroy the wife. It handed Janet Leigh the perfect weapon to trigger Tony Curtis's permanent, agonizing downfall. By 1960, Janet Leigh was operating on a level of professional influence few women had achieved. Her collaboration with Alfred Hitchcock on the thriller Psycho granted her genuine, unassailable structural power. She had proven she could carry a groundbreaking, controversial film and turn it into a massive financial success. Studio bosses respected her as a consummate professional who viewed her career with the detached precision of a chief executive officer. Tony Curtis, however, navigated a fundamentally different reality. Born Bernard Schwartz to Hungarian Jewish immigrants in the Bronx, his childhood was marked by severe financial hardship and domestic challenges. His ascent to Hollywood stardom was fueled by a desperate need to escape his origins. The studio system packaged him as a breezy, confident heartthrob, but the artificial nature of his creation left him with a profound lifelong inferiority complex. He harbored a deep resentment toward the Hollywood establishment, fighting viciously for gritty roles in films like Sweet Smell of Success to prove he was more than a manufactured commodity. This profound internal insecurity created a highly destabilizing dynamic within his marriage. Tony was married to a woman who possessed exactly what he lacked: effortless professional respect and a stable, unshakable sense of self. Janet Leigh did not suffer from imposter syndrome. She was comfortable in boardrooms, she was respected by the ruthless men who ran the studios, and she navigated the treacherous waters of Hollywood politics with calm, aristocratic grace. Instead of finding solace in his wife's strength, Tony found it intimidating. In the rigid patriarchal culture of the late 1950s and early 1960s, a man's worth was often measured by his absolute dominance over his household. Tony Curtis, the global sex symbol, felt entirely overshadowed by the sheer competence and rising authority of his own wife. He felt small in his own home. He perceived Janet's calm pragmatism as coldness, and her professional success as a direct threat to his masculinity. The pressure cooker of their existence, the grueling filming schedules, the relentless demands of the studio PR machine, the lack of any genuine privacy, and the widening psychological gulf between them, began to crack the foundation of the marriage. Tony could not control the studio bosses. He could not erase his difficult past, and he could not overpower his wife's formidable intellect and industry standing. He wanted situations where he felt admired, powerful, and fully in control. He needed a mechanism to soothe his battered ego and validate the masculine persona he was struggling to maintain. He found this validation in the systematic, compulsive pursuit of other women. For Tony Curtis, the transgressions were less about romance and more about ego and validation. It was about power. It was a psychological coping mechanism. Pursuing relationships with younger and less established actresses provided him with a temporary, intoxicating illusion of control. When he attracted admiration from younger women who were intimidated by his fame and dependent on his influence, he did not feel like the insecure boy from the Bronx. He felt like a king. These women were not partners. They were mirrors reflecting back the idealized, omnipotent version of Tony Curtis that he desperately wanted to believe was real. Janet Leigh was not oblivious to these indiscretions. The Whisper network in Hollywood was highly efficient, and the signs of a wandering husband are universal. However, Janet approached the deterioration of her marriage with the same clinical strategic mindset she applied to her career. She did not engage in hysterical confrontations or throw public tantrums. She understood the economic and social ramifications of a public scandal. For years, she chose to maintain the corporate facade, absorbing the private humiliation in order to protect their children, their brand, and their standing within the Universal Pictures hierarchy. She managed her husband's behavior as one might manage a chronic, low-grade liability in a business portfolio. But a marriage sustained entirely by corporate mandates, public relations strategies, and silent endurance is fundamentally unsustainable. The structural foundation of their highly publicized marriage was steadily collapsing. The smiles on the magazine covers were becoming increasingly strained. The silences in their Beverly Hills mansion were growing heavier, and Tony Curtis's desperate need for external validation was escalating to a dangerous level. At high-profile industry galas during this period, the physical distance between the couple became impossible to conceal. While Janet expertly navigated rooms filled with powerful producers, radiating untouchable grace, Tony stood rigidly at the margins, consuming heavy spirits and watching his wife command the space he felt he deserved. Industry insiders noted how his manic, forced laughter contrasted sharply with her quiet, deadly composure. He was a man visibly drowning in his own inadequacy, standing right next to the woman who effortlessly possessed the oxygen he desperately needed. He was no longer satisfied with brief, discreet encounters that could be easily swept under the rug by studio fixers. His ego required a larger validation. He was unconsciously seeking an event significant enough to alter the suffocating structure of his life, regardless of the collateral damage it would cause. The stage was meticulously set for a total systemic collapse. The Hollywood machine had pushed its golden couple to the absolute limit of human endurance. All that was required was a catalyst, a single volatile element introduced into the unstable environment to trigger the shift. That catalyst would not be found in the familiar, highly monitored sound stages of Los Angeles. It would be found thousands of miles away, on a chaotic film set in South America, in the form of a very young actress who was about to become entangled in the collapse of a famous Hollywood marriage. The disintegration of the Hollywood studio system's most lucrative marriage did not occur within the heavily monitored, sanitized confines of Los Angeles. It required a geography of isolation, a place where the pervasive surveillance network of studio fixers and gossip columnists could not easily penetrate. In 1961, the production of the historical epic Taras Bulba provided precisely this environment. Filmed on the remote, rugged plains of Salta, Argentina, the production was a chaotic, physically grueling, and massively expensive logistical nightmare. It was thousands of miles away from the boardrooms of Universal Pictures and the immaculate lawns of Beverly Hills. In this lawless, high-pressure vacuum, the rigid social contracts of Hollywood temporarily evaporated. Tony Curtis arrived in Argentina carrying the invisible, crushing weight of his own profound insecurity. He was 36 years old, an age when the initial effortless gloss of a manufactured teen idol begins to inevitably fade. He was still a massive box office draw, but internally, he was a man running out of oxygen. He was exhausted from the relentless performance of the perfect husband and deeply diminished by the formidable self-possessed competence of his wife, Janet Leigh, who was back in the United States managing their empire and basking in the critical triumph of Psycho. Into this volatile psychological landscape walked Christine Kaufman. She was still a very young actress at the beginning of her international career. Born in Austria and raised in Germany, Christine was not a hardened, cynical product of the American studio machine. She was a European prodigy, having acted in film since childhood. Yet she possessed an undeniable, breathtaking innocence. She was an incandescent beauty, radiating the kind of effortless, unmanufactured youth that Hollywood executives spent millions of dollars trying to artificially replicate. To Tony Curtis, Christine Kaufman was not merely an attractive co-star, she was someone whose admiration and inexperience deeply appealed to him emotionally. If Janet Leigh represented the intimidating reality of a powerful equal partner, Christine represented the ultimate blank slate. She was young enough to be influenced, foreign enough to be isolated, and inexperienced enough to look at Tony Curtis not as a flawed, deeply insecure man, but as a cinematic god. When Tony looked into Christine's eyes, he did not see the intimidating intellect or the strategic calculation he faced at home. He saw pure, unadulterated awe. For a man starving for absolute validation, that admiration became emotionally overwhelming for him. The courtship that unfolded on the plains of Argentina was not a sweeping organic romance. It was gradually dominating the emotional environment surrounding the young actress. Tony Curtis did not woo Christine Kaufman. He overwhelmed her. He used his fame, influence, and industry power to deeply shape the emotional world of a much younger actress. From Christine's perspective, the relationship possessed all the intoxicating elements of a tragic, romantic epic. She was a teenager thrust into a foreign environment, working on a massive, chaotic film set. Suddenly, the most famous, desirable man in the production, perhaps the most famous man she had ever met, was focusing the entirety of his blinding attention exclusively on her. Tony played the role of the tragic, misunderstood hero to perfection. He utilized his actual unhappiness to construct a highly persuasive narrative, painting his marriage to Janet Leigh as a cold, loveless corporate prison from which he desperately needed to be rescued. He positioned himself not as a wealthy married celebrity involved in a highly controversial relationship with a much younger actress, but as a vulnerable soul who had finally found true understanding in the eyes of a beautiful European girl. He reframed the controversial dynamic as a misunderstood romance that transcended public criticism. Christine, possessing the natural romantic fatalism of a 17-year-old, swallowed this narrative whole. She genuinely believed that her love was the cure for his deeply rooted pain. She believed they were allies fighting against a cruel, uncomprehending world. She lacked the life experience to recognize how emotionally dependent the relationship had become. Tony Curtis's behavior during the production of Taras Bulba was increasing emotional dependence and social isolation. He used his status as the lead actor to dictate the social hierarchy of the set. He became increasingly emotionally reliant on her attention and presence between takes. He showered her with extravagant, expensive gifts that a teenager could not possibly afford or reciprocate, instantly establishing a profound financial imbalance. He effectively built a glittering invisible wall around her, cutting her off from objective advice or the grounded perspective of her peers. The relationship gradually became emotionally dependent and increasingly isolating. By removing her from her normal support systems and placing her in a state of constant, overwhelming adulation, he gradually reduced her independence. He was not nurturing a partner. He was encouraging a relationship centered entirely around his needs. He was building a woman whose entire existence and sense of self-worth would be tethered exclusively to his approval. In Christine, Tony finally found an arena where he could be the dominant figure in the relationship. However, the fundamental law of the 20th century entertainment complex is that isolation is a temporary illusion. The remote plains of Argentina could delay the inevitable, but they could not prevent it. The film's set was not a closed ecosystem. It was populated by hundreds of crew members, local contractors, and international press liaisons. In an industry where information is currency, a secret of this magnitude possessed an incredibly high market value. The hushed conversations between takes, the prolonged absences from the main camp, the undeniable physical proximity between the 36-year-old married superstar and the 17-year-old ingenue, these data points were quickly gathered, packaged, and prepared for export. The paparazzi, the ruthless foot soldiers of the global tabloid economy, infiltrated the production. They operated with extreme persistence and patience. They did not need a confession or a formal announcement. They only needed a single, irrefutable visual document. They captured the photographs, the intimate glances, the shared physical space, the unmistakable signs of a controversial relationship. The moment the camera shutters clicked in Argentina, the private psychological drama between Tony Curtis and Christine Kaufman ceased to belong to them. The photographic evidence was placed on planes, wired across continents, and delivered directly to the editorial desks of the most aggressive media syndicates in the United States and Europe. Back in Los Angeles, in the heavily fortified executive boardrooms of Universal Pictures, the intelligence landed with immediate concern from studio executives. The studio bosses, men who operated strictly on the cold, hard mathematics of risk assessment and brand management, stared at the photographs and realized their most valuable corporate asset was actively compromising his career. This was not a minor indiscretion that could be easily managed by a discreet studio fixer. The optics were extremely damaging to his public image. Tony Curtis, the blueprint of the wholesome American husband, was carrying on a highly controversial relationship with a much younger European actress. It was a scandal that contained every necessary element to incite a massive public backlash: infidelity, the destruction of a beloved Hollywood family, and the highly controversial age disparity. The executives immediately understood the financial ramifications. If the public turned against Tony Curtis, if the powerful decency leagues organized boycotts, the box office projections for his upcoming slate of films would evaporate. More terrifyingly, the scandal threatened to taint Janet Leigh, dragging one of the industry's most bankable, respected stars into a sordid, humiliating public feud. The studio machinery instantly shifted from promotion to aggressive damage control. They needed to contain the blast radius. Their initial strategy was the standard Hollywood playbook: deny, obfuscate, and prepare to manipulate the narrative. They anticipated that the impending media storm would force the three individuals involved into predictable, easily manageable roles. The executives, the gossip columnists, and the tabloid editors all began salivating at the prospect of the coming spectacle. They readied their printing presses for a lucrative, prolonged war. They expected Tony Curtis to offer a groveling, pathetic public apology. They expected Christine Kaufman to be universally branded and isolated as the controversial young outsider blamed for the collapse of the marriage. Above all, they expected Janet Leigh to fulfill her assigned corporate duty. They expected the betrayed wife to break down, to weep for the cameras, to fight viciously for her straying husband, and to provide the emotional spectacle that drove magazine sales. They anticipated a hysterical, highly profitable public feud that would dominate the cultural conversation for months. They fundamentally miscalculated the intellectual fortitude of the woman they were dealing with. As the photographs hit the newsstands and the scandal detonated across the global media landscape, the Universal Pictures executives waited for Janet Leigh's panicked phone call. They waited for the tears. They waited for the opportunity to step in, manage the public fallout, and dictate her public response. The phone did not ring. Instead, from her Beverly Hills estate, Janet Leigh looked at the wreckage of her manufactured empire, observed the 17-year-old girl who had unwittingly triggered the situation, and surveyed the husband who had orchestrated it. She did not prepare a statement of grief. She prepared a legal strategy. The studio and the press were setting a stage for a melodramatic tragedy, completely unaware that the A-list matriarch was about to systematically rewrite the script and turn a tabloid scandal into a masterclass of cold and highly strategic legal response. When the photographic evidence of Tony Curtis and Christine Kaufman's relationship was syndicated across the global press network in 1962, the Hollywood establishment braced itself for a highly predictable, highly profitable spectacle. The studio system, though in its twilight, still operated on a rigid set of archetypal narratives. The machinery of public relations was fundamentally patriarchal. It understood how to monetize male indiscretion by exploiting female suffering. The executives at Universal Pictures, alongside the ruthless syndicate of gossip columnists led by Hedda Hopper and Louella Parsons, immediately drafted the script for the impending scandal. It was a formula that had been tested and proven to sell millions of magazines and movie tickets. The script required 3 players to assume their designated positions. Tony Curtis was to play the errant, momentarily confused husband who had succumbed to temptation. Christine Kaufman was to be branded the exotic, wicked disruptor, a title that, while insulting, would guarantee her name remained in the headlines. But the entire financial viability of this media circus rested entirely on the performance of the third player, Janet Leigh. The Hollywood cartel required Janet to play the role of the devastated weeping victim. They needed her to grant tearful interviews from the immaculate living room of her Beverly Hills estate. They expected her to issue frantic, emotional pleas for her husband's return. They anticipated a vicious mudslinging campaign where the betrayed wife would utilize her industry connections to publicly humiliate the 17-year-old interloper. This was the transaction the studios relied upon: the public consumption of a woman's dignity in exchange for sustained cultural relevance. Janet Leigh looked at the script the media had prepared for her, and she completely rejected it. She executed a strategy that left the tabloids starving and the studio executives entirely paralyzed. She chose a weapon that the loud, chaotic ecosystem of Hollywood was completely unequipped to handle: absolute glacial silence. In the 1960s, the Hollywood media machine dictated that public scandals required emotional reactions, Silence was widely viewed as a terminal admission of defeat. For an actress, relevancy was tied to visibility. When a scandal broke, the instinct of almost every star was to run to the press to control the narrative. If you did not defend your territory in the gossip columns, you were considered weak, and in Hollywood, weakness was a terminal diagnosis. Janet Leigh defied this logic. She recognized that her primary asset was not her marriage to Tony Curtis. It was her unassailable A-list status. She had just redefined cinematic history with Psycho. She possessed an innate aristocratic dignity. She understood that engaging in a public screaming match over a man who had chosen to behave like a reckless adolescent would instantly devalue her brand. Lowering herself to fight in the tabloid mud with a 17-year-old girl would drag her from the pedestal of a respected leading lady down to the level of a cheap soap opera character. Therefore, Janet instituted an absolute gag order. She barred her publicists from issuing any statements regarding her emotional state. She continued to fulfill her professional obligations, arriving on film sets meticulously prepared, impeccably dressed, and completely composed. When aggressive reporters thrust microphones into her face, demanding a reaction to the latest photos of Tony and Christine in Europe, she offered them a polite, impenetrable smile and walked past them. This silence was not a trauma response. It was a highly calculated, aggressive corporate maneuver. By refusing to speak Christine Kaufman's name, Janet Leigh executed the most effective form of Hollywood erasure. She denied the young actress the massive publicity boost that a feud with an A-list titan would have provided. Christine was looking to enter the American market, and a public battle with Janet Leigh would have plastered her name across every marquee in the country. By ignoring her entirely, Janet denied her rival the necessary oxygen to survive in the American media landscape. It was a silent decree from the top of the hierarchy. You are entirely irrelevant to my existence. While the press floundered, desperately trying to generate drama out of a void, Janet shifted her focus from public relations to the cold, hard mechanics of asset liquidation. She did not wait for Tony Curtis to return from South America to negotiate a reconciliation. She did not attend couples counseling brokered by studio fixers. Instead, she summoned her legal team. Janet Leigh handled the legal dissolution of her marriage with swift, uncompromising efficiency. When Tony Curtis finally returned to Los Angeles, the anticipated explosive confrontation never materialized. The ultimate climax of their decade-long marriage did not take place in their sprawling estate, but across a polished table in a sterile legal office. Tony arrived expecting a tearful reconciliation attempt or a vicious argument, armed with the justifications he had rehearsed on the flight from Argentina. Instead, he found Janet seated calmly next to her attorneys, her demeanor entirely devoid of personal affection or visible anger. She refused to speak the name of the young actress waiting for him in Europe. She simply slid a meticulously prepared stack of dissolution documents across the table. In that single chilling moment of absolute silence, the power dynamics completely inverted. Tony, the global icon who believed he dictated the terms of his reality, was reduced to a silent, heavily penalized liability, facing a woman who surveyed him with mild corporate impatience. California community property laws were unforgiving, and the financial portfolio Janet and Tony had built together was massive. It included sprawling real estate, lucrative stock options, and percentage points on future box office grosses. Tony Curtis, a man notoriously insecure about his wealth and driven by the frantic spending habits of a boy who grew up in severe financial hardship, was suddenly forced to face the terrifying reality of a forensic financial audit. Janet instructed her attorneys to execute a clean, uncompromising division of their assets. There were no prolonged emotional courtroom battles. There was no leveraging of their two young daughters for public sympathy. The divorce petition was filed swiftly and efficiently. This legal maneuver had a profound psychological impact on Tony Curtis. He had entered the relationship with Christine Kaufman operating under the delusion that he held all the power. His fragile ego had convinced him that Janet would be devastated by his absence, that she would fight for him, and that her desperation would validate his ultimate superiority. Instead, he was met with a swift, bureaucratic dismissal. Janet's reaction proved to him the one truth he had spent his entire life running from. He was not the center of her universe. She did not need him to survive financially, socially, or professionally. While he was gallivanting across continents, entangled in a scandalous, highly criticized romance with a teenager, his wife was sitting in a lawyer's office, quietly and efficiently cutting him out of her life as one might excise a malfunctioning subsidiary from a corporate portfolio. The loss of dominance was total. Tony Curtis had sought to exert authority by betraying his wife, only to discover that his wife possessed the power to permanently erase his access to her life without shedding a single tear. He was left standing in the wreckage of his own making, holding the hand of a 17-year-old girl, while the woman he had abandoned simply closed the door, locked it, and walked away. Furthermore, Janet's handling of the crisis served as a profound silent rebellion against the studio system itself. Universal Pictures had spent a decade attempting to own her image, dictating how she should behave, who she should be seen with, and how she should react to adversity. By refusing to play the victim, she broke the machine. The executives realized they had absolutely no leverage over her. They could not threaten her with bad press because she refused to engage with the press. They could not threaten her financial stability because she had already secured her own capital. In the high-stakes game of Hollywood optics, Janet Leigh achieved the impossible. She navigated a devastating public betrayal and emerged not as a tragedy, but as an untouchable matriarch. She set a dangerous, revolutionary precedent for women in the industry. You do not have to bleed for the cameras to maintain your crown. You can simply enforce the law, protect your assets, and let the unstable men compromise themselves. But as Janet Leigh successfully insulated her empire in Los Angeles, the reality of the prize that Christine Kaufman had allegedly won was beginning to reveal its true highly restrictive nature. The glittering illusion of the European romance was about to collide violently with the deeply controlling reality of Tony Curtis's psyche. In the immediate aftermath of the scandal, the Hollywood press apparatus rapidly constructed a new, highly sanitized narrative to accommodate the shifting reality. Tony Curtis and Christine Kaufman were married in early 1963. To the casual observer consuming the heavily curated spreads in lifestyle magazines, Christine had achieved the ultimate, highly coveted victory. She had successfully extracted one of the world's most desirable leading men from his established marriage, secured the platinum wedding band, and inherited the keys to the Beverly Hills kingdom. The media framed her as the triumphant conqueror in a high-stakes romantic war. The reality of her existence within that kingdom, however, was fundamentally different. The marriage was not a romantic triumph. It was an emotionally restrictive and highly monitored environment. Tony Curtis constructed his second marriage not as an equal partnership, but as a rigid domestic hierarchy designed to guarantee his authority. Following the devastating clinical efficiency of Janet Leigh's divorce proceedings, Curtis's ego had been systematically dismantled. He had been exposed not as an omnipotent Hollywood patriarch, but as a highly replaceable, financially liable employee in his own life. He was reeling from a profound sense of diminishment. He did not marry Christine Kaufman to forge a partnership of equals. He married her to construct a controlled environment where his absolute dominance could never again be questioned. Christine was transitioning from late adolescence into her early 20s, a period of rapid cognitive and emotional development. Yet, the parameters of her marriage required her to remain in a state of arrested development. Tony utilized the massive disparity in their age, wealth, and industry, standing to establish a rigid, non-negotiable domestic hierarchy. The strict parameters of the relationship effectively suppressed her independence. Before arriving in the United States, Christine Kaufman was not a naive amateur. She was an established, highly regarded actress in European cinema. She possessed her own artistic ambitions and a deep cultural lineage. Tony Curtis methodically moved to sever her from those roots. He actively discouraged her from pursuing film roles in Hollywood. He utilized the birth of their two daughters as the ultimate justification for her professional confinement, insisting that her sole exclusive duty was to remain at home as a traditional, subservient mother and wife. This was not an act of paternalistic protection. It was a calculated strategy of isolation. By removing Christine from the workforce, Tony stripped her of her financial autonomy and her access to a peer network. He effectively cut her off from the very industry that could provide her with an independent identity. He required her to be a beautiful silent accessory, a physical testament to his virility and control, waiting dutifully in their mansion while he navigated the turbulent waters of his own fluctuating career. The studio system implicitly endorsed this arrangement. For Universal Pictures and the broader public relations cartel, a quiet, domesticated Christine Kaufman was the optimal outcome. It neutralized the highly controversial narrative. If she remained out of the spotlight and played the role of the devoted mother, the scandal would eventually lose its commercial value, and Tony Curtis's brand could be stabilized. She was essentially ordered to sacrifice her own trajectory to rehabilitate his. However, the architecture of this control relied on a fatal miscalculation. The assumption that a young, beautiful woman inherently lacks intellectual substance. Christine Kaufman was not a passive, vacuous starlet desperate to cling to the American aristocracy. She possessed a sharp, analytical mind and a deep European cultural sensibility that fundamentally clashed with the superficial, highly transactional nature of 1960s Los Angeles. As she matured, the glittering facade of her Hollywood life began to dissolve, revealing the oppressive, suffocating reality underneath. She observed the social ecosystem of Beverly Hills, a landscape dominated by older, powerful men and the younger, compliant women they treated as depreciating assets. She attended the elite industry parties, standing silently beside her husband, and recognized the exact dynamics at play. She saw the fear in the eyes of the other Hollywood wives, women who were terrified of aging, terrified of losing their status, and utterly dependent on the volatile moods of their husbands. More critically, she began to objectively observe the man she had married. The charismatic, misunderstood hero who had wooed her on the remote plains of Argentina was exposed as a deeply anxious, highly controlling, and profoundly insecure individual. As the 1960s progressed, Tony Curtis's career began to encounter significant turbulence. The cultural shift toward gritty, realistic cinema was making his brand of polished, studio-manufactured charm increasingly obsolete. Faced with declining box office returns and the loss of his A-list invincibility, his behavior at home became more erratic and demanding. He required constant, exhausting validation to soothe his professional anxieties, and he expected Christine to serve as his permanent, unwavering emotional buffer. The breaking point was not a sudden, dramatic confrontation. It was a gradual, highly lucid awakening. Christine realized that her presence in Tony Curtis's life was not a testament to his love for her, but a testament to his desperation for control. She recognized that remaining in the marriage meant the permanent erasure of her own identity. She was facing the prospect of spending the next decades of her life functioning as a highly decorated dependent in a corporate town that viewed her solely as an appendage to a fading star. To survive, she had to execute a strategic withdrawal. In 1968, Christine Kaufman initiated the protocol for her emancipation. Her methodology was as swift and clinical as Janet Leigh's had been, but it carried an entirely different symbolic weight. When the news of their separation broke, the American media apparatus prepared to deploy the standard gold digger narrative. The press anticipated that the young European wife would utilize the California courts to extract a massive financial settlement, demanding alimony to maintain her Beverly Hills lifestyle. They expected her to fight for the mansion, the jewelry, and a permanent place within the Hollywood social elite. Christine shattered this narrative completely. She demonstrated a profound, almost aggressive lack of interest in Tony Curtis's wealth. Her legal demands were focused squarely on the only assets she genuinely valued: her autonomy and her children. She filed for divorce, citing severe emotional distress, a stark public indictment of the psychological pressure she had endured. She fought relentlessly for physical custody of their two daughters. Once the legal parameters of her exit were secured, she executed a maneuver that left the Los Angeles establishment entirely bewildered. She did not leverage her high-profile divorce to secure a new studio contract. She did not attempt to transition into the role of a wealthy Hollywood divorcee. Instead, she packed her belongings, took her daughters, and boarded a flight back to Germany. This transatlantic flight was not a retreat. It was a definitive, highly visible rejection of the entire American celebrity complex. By deliberately abandoning the epicenter of global entertainment, Christine Kaufman proved that she was entirely immune to the addictive gravity of Hollywood. She proved that the mansion, the status, and the proximity to the studio bosses meant absolutely nothing to her if the cost of admission was her own subjugation. She severed the geographical and psychological ties to her ex-husband with absolute finality. She removed herself and her children from his sphere of influence, ensuring that he could no longer use his industry power or his wealth to dictate her reality. In doing so, she administered a second devastating psychological blow to Tony Curtis. Within the span of a single decade, the actor had attempted to assert his dominance over two entirely different women, one a formidable, established American matriarch, the other a young, seemingly pliant European ingenue. Both women, utilizing entirely different strategies, had arrived at the exact same conclusion. He was a man unworthy of their trust and sacrifice. Both women had looked at the empire he offered, calculated the cost to their own independence, and walked away without looking back. As Christine Kaufman's plane touched down in Europe, She was no longer the scandalous 17-year-old disruptor, nor was she the suppressed decorative wife. She was a woman who had successfully navigated the most challenging, demanding corporate ecosystem on the planet, recognized the boundaries, and stepped outside of them. She was returning to her roots not as a defeated casualty, but as a sovereign entity, preparing to build a new empire strictly on her own terms. Meanwhile, back in the sprawling, echoing emptiness of his Los Angeles estate, Tony Curtis was left to face the terrifying silence of a kingdom that no one wanted to share with him. The immediate aftermath of a highly publicized Hollywood divorce is typically characterized by a predictable transactional distribution of power. The media machine naturally gravitates toward the individual who successfully leverages the scandal into greater cultural visibility or financial gain. In the wake of Tony Curtis's consecutive marital collapses, the industry braced for the fallout, anticipating a prolonged, messy public spectacle. What occurred instead was a profound demonstration of structural independence. The two women who had been utilized by the tabloids as the opposing poles of a scandalous narrative completely refused to participate in the expected post-mortem. By exiting the arena on their own terms, Janet Leigh and Christine Kaufman effectively starved the media cycle and cemented their respective sovereignties. Janet Leigh's trajectory following her divorce in 1962 was a masterclass in long-term brand stabilization. She did not exploit her single status for public sympathy, nor did she engage in the frantic, highly publicized dating rituals typical of recently divorced starlets. Her primary objective was the fortification of her professional and personal infrastructure. In late 1962, she married Robert Brandt, a highly successful stockbroker. This union was the antithesis of her previous marriage. It was not a merger of two competing celebrity egos designed to maximize box office returns. It was a grounded private partnership built on mutual respect and distinct spheres of influence. Brandt operated entirely outside the Hollywood ecosystem, providing Janet with a stable, secure foundation insulated from the chaotic volatility of the entertainment industry. Professionally, Janet Leigh maintained her A-list status with unwavering discipline. She continued to secure prominent roles in major studio productions, such as the 1962 film The Manchurian Candidate and the 1963 hit Bye Bye Birdie, proving that her box office viability was entirely independent of her association with Tony Curtis. She transitioned seamlessly from the role of the desirable young starlet to the respected authoritative veteran actress. She authored books, served on the boards of prominent charities, and carefully curated her legacy. She had successfully extracted herself from a highly unstable corporate arrangement and built an unassailable fortress of respectability. She reigned over her life with the quiet, absolute authority of a woman who knows she cannot be broken by the system because she holds the deeds to her own survival. Thousands of miles away, on a different continent, Christine Kaufman was executing a parallel strategy of self-determination, albeit through a radically different operational model. Her return to Europe in 1968 was not a quiet retirement. It was an aggressive reclamation of her artistic and entrepreneurial identity. Free from the stifling, restrictive mandates of her American marriage, Christine reintegrated herself into the European cultural landscape with remarkable agility. She did not seek to replicate the hyper-commercialized stardom of Hollywood. Instead, she aligned herself with the avant-garde, intellectually rigorous world of the new German cinema. She collaborated with visionary, iconoclastic directors like Werner Fassbinder, taking on complex, challenging roles that required genuine psychological depth rather than mere physical allure. She proved to the European critical establishment that she was a serious, formidable artist, completely dispelling the American narrative that had attempted to reduce her to a decorative accessory. But Christine Kaufmann's ambition extended far beyond the cinema. She possessed a sharp analytical business acumen that had been entirely suppressed during her time in Los Angeles. Recognizing the ephemeral nature of an acting career, she strategically diversified her portfolio. She leveraged her extensive knowledge of European beauty traditions and her inherent understanding of branding to launch her own highly successful cosmetics and wellness empire. She authored best-selling books on health and beauty, built a massive, loyal consumer base, and established herself as a prominent, highly respected entrepreneur. She became a fixture on European television, not as an actress promoting a film, but as a commanding, authoritative CEO managing her own multinational corporation. She had transformed the young, naive girl who had been influenced on the plains of Argentina into a powerful, self-sustaining matriarch. She had proven that true autonomy is achieved not by marrying power, but by building it from the ground up. The contrast between the ascending trajectories of these two women and the slow, agonizing decline of the man they had left behind was stark and undeniable. The tragic reality of Tony Curtis's later life was that his downfall required no external sabotage. Neither Janet Leigh nor Christine Kaufmann needed to coordinate a revenge plot or utilize their influence to sideline him. They simply removed themselves from his orbit and allowed the natural, unforgiving physics of the Hollywood ecosystem to take over. Tony Curtis's entire psychological architecture was built on the desperate need for constant external validation. He required women to reflect his virility, and he required the studio system to reflect his importance. When both of those mirrors were removed, the internal void became unbearable. As the 1970s progressed, the cinematic landscape shifted dramatically. The era of the polished, studio-manufactured leading man was gone, replaced by the gritty, uncompromising realism of the new Hollywood movement. Directors like Coppola and Scorsese were not interested in the highly stylized, superficial charm that Curtis had perfected. His brand was obsolete. Curtis made one final aggressive attempt to salvage his artistic credibility before the studio system fully collapsed. Recognizing that his days as a youthful romantic lead were numbered, he actively campaigned for the dark, disturbing role of Albert DeSalvo in the true crime thriller, The Boston Strangler. He altered his appearance, gained weight, and abandoned his trademark charm to play a ruthless killer. While the performance earned a Golden Globe nomination and temporarily shocked critics who had dismissed him as a lightweight, it was a hollow victory. The industry was fundamentally changing. The arrival of raw, method-trained actors permanently altered the standard for leading men. Curtis was still viewed as a relic of a bygone era. He could put on the mask of a gritty character, but he could not shed the manufactured studio polish that defined his early existence. As the major studios began investing heavily in counterculture films and anti-establishment narratives, the demand for highly paid contract stars evaporated. His brief critical resurgence failed to generate lasting momentum, leaving him professionally stranded, just as his personal life entered another phase of severe instability. Faced with a declining career and the terrifying silence of his personal life, Curtis sought refuge in the only coping mechanisms he knew. He plunged into a series of increasingly chaotic, short-lived marriages to significantly younger women, desperately attempting to recreate the dynamic of control and adulation he had briefly enjoyed with Christine Kaufman. But these unions were hollow, frantic attempts to stop the bleeding. They provided no genuine stability, only temporary, expensive distractions. Simultaneously, his reliance on chemical substances escalated from a recreational habit to a severe, debilitating dependency. Heavy stimulants and spirits became his primary defense mechanisms against the crushing reality of his diminishing relevance. He became unreliable on set, a liability that major studios were no longer willing to underwrite. He was relegated to guest appearances on television shows and roles in forgettable B-movies. The man who had once commanded the highest salaries in the world was reduced to trading on the fading fumes of his past glory. Despite retaining his sprawling estates and residual fame, Curtis found himself increasingly isolated as the new Hollywood era rendered his traditional leading man persona obsolete. He had spent his life treating the women who loved him as disposable assets, only to discover that without their strength, their competence, and their silent management of his flaws, he was entirely incapable of managing himself. The ultimate devastating irony of this Hollywood saga is the clarity of its conclusion. The Universal Pictures PR machine had attempted to dictate a narrative where women were the emotional casualties of male desire. They had tried to frame Janet Leigh as the discarded victim and Christine Kaufman as the tragic, ruined outsider. Instead, the two women completely subverted the script. They utilized their distinct forms of leverage, legal, financial, and geographical, to execute flawless, bloodless extractions. They refused to be consumed by the scandal, choosing instead to convert their respective challenges into the foundational capital for their own independent empires. They lived long, productive, and highly autonomous lives, securing their legacies entirely on their own merits. Tony Curtis believed he held all the cards, expecting the women in his life to either fight for him or be destroyed by his absence. Instead, they simply walked away, leaving him entirely alone to navigate a decline of his own making.